I was putting together the test build for the channel and thought it would be fun to have you join along. Perhaps you've always wanted to put together a small form factor PC for 4K gaming. Maybe you're moving parts over from another SFF build, or this is your first ever PC build. Whatever it is, let's put this little powerhouse together. Hey there, and welcome to Machines and More. I was putting together the Cooler Master NR200P Ryzen 5000 test build for the channel, so thought I would do a more detailed build tutorial at the same time for this reference build. As many of you know, I really like this case, but really for how it makes small form factor computing approachable for even a brand new builder. Even if you're a dyed-in-the-wool enthusiast, this case has a lot to offer too. Basically for any level of PC builder, it's super enjoyable. This video is fairly detailed, so it's geared towards the first-time builder or first-time SFF builders. But even if you're an experienced builder, I hope you can get some tips and tricks from this video. And I will be leaving timestamps so that you can skip ahead if you would like. If this is your first build, that's so awesome. And you chose to do it in a wonderful case. And welcome to the club. I'll list the component selection for this build and then I'll walk through the components in more detail during the build. Also, I will leave a list of full build components down below with links so that you can go ahead directly and pick them from Amazon if you would like. This build would be ideal for 4K gaming, but it would also be great for 1080p or 1440p gaming and even workstation or light production tasks. A quick side note is that as of mid-November, most motherboards won't be compatible with Ryzen 5000 out of the box just yet, so you will have to update the BIOS. You can do that if you have a Ryzen 3000 CPU, or since the board we're doing this build with has QFlash ability, you can just make a USB updater on a different computer and then flash the BIOS on the motherboard. When motherboards come out with official Ryzen 5000 compatibility, you're good to go out of the box. The case we'll be building in today is the black NR200P from Cooler Master. Inside will go a Gigabyte B550 Aorus Pro AX motherboard with the new Ryzen 5 5600X CPU. To cool that, we'll go with Scythe's Mugen 5 CPU tower cooler. Storage will be in the form of an M.2 Samsung 970 EVO 500GB SSD. 32GB of Corsair's Vengeance RGB RAM will round out the rest of our motherboard components. Our 4K gaming factory will have the Nvidia 3080 Founders Edition card at its core, and even though the Ryzen 5 just sips power and you won't need all of it, I'll go ahead and build this one with the Cooler Master V850 SFX power supply for maximum efficiency, and this will also help future-proof the system for a really small premium over a suitable 650 watt or 750 watt unit. Finally, to light up the system, we'll throw in Cooler Master's Master Fan Halo RGB. Big thanks to Cooler Master for providing some of the build components for us to check out today in this build, and let's get started. So what we can do now is start by cleaning up our workstation a little bit. We don't need the GPU now, so we can set this aside. You won't need this until the very end. The other thing we can put away is the CPU tower itself, because we won't be attaching this until the very end. So when you get the case, just open it up. So I've gone ahead and taken out the screwdriver from the Mugen 5, which is one of the nicest included screwdrivers with any CPU cooler. And we'll go ahead and just take off this rad panel. We won't be needing this since we're building in the NR200P, and just set that aside. And you can also save these two screws because what this will end up being will be for the motherboard standoffs like that. So, and you can go ahead and take out two PCIe slot covers, because we will just go ahead and use these screws for securing the motherboard. Let's go ahead and set those 4 screws aside. This is the accessory box. We have 2 fans inside. We can choose to use these, or we can go with flash or master fans. Both will work just fine for the case. What I'd like to do now is take out the splitter, since we'll be connecting that first, and you can leave the fans alone for now, and take out the hardware pack, since we'll be using that. You don't need the riser cable for this build, since we're not doing a vertical GPU build, but that alone is pretty much the difference of cost between the NR200 and the NR200P. So we're gonna go ahead and take out this silver piece and hold on to these little bits if you wanna attach a SATA SSD. So now we're gonna do some case prep first. And the first thing I'll do is check that the motherboard standoffs are secure. What you'll use is this little adapter piece that we just check out, and just make sure they're all tight. Just make sure it's secure. We won't actually be needing to take apart any of these ribs, so we can go ahead and just screw everything down. These look pretty good. You don't have to snug it down too much. And then give the case a little once over. Just tighten down all the screws. And then go ahead and just pry off the top of the case. To do that, pull here. And it'll be a little tight, but don't be afraid. And at the bottom of the case is a screw. Take this one out. And then with that, you can just pop off the bottom of the case. We'll leave this as open as possible. That way it's easy for us to maneuver in and out. Quick overview of the I/O. This is the USB 3 connector for the front panel. This is the front panel audio. And this is probably the nicest feature of the front I/O, is this cable. It's pre-sleeved here, so you don't even have to worry about plugging individual things onto your motherboard. So this is just all ready to go. Go ahead and flip the case over. I really like how this black one feels. It's got this nice texture here. Take off that panel. We will put it back later, so keep it safe. You don't need it for now. And we'll just go ahead and unscrew the PSU shroud. Okay, you won't set those screws aside. You will need those later. And then this is SFX and SFXL. So if you were running a bigger SFXL power supply, you would just move it over here. You will lose full fan compatibility over it. So I do always recommend using an SFX supply for building this case. Okay, and we can just take this shroud off. And you can leave these here, it's fine. The best way to route these cables, there's a groove cut here. So later on, when we're ready to start connecting our front or managing our front I/O, we'll just set this over like this. We can go ahead and prep our motherboard. So this is Gigabyte's Aorus B550 ITX motherboard, and I think this one is the best motherboard for the NR200 because it's got overkill VRM stages, so you can run up to even a 5950X without breaking a sweat. Completely passive cooling on this board, so you don't have an annoying M.2 VRM fan. And also, you're not paying for a USB-C front header that you're not able to use. So go ahead and open up the CPU socket. You'll just, there's this lever here, you just pull that open. And go ahead and take out the CPU and we'll pop it right in. From the rear I/O side, you should always be able to read the Ryzen lettering. There's also a small golden arrow, and that should always line up with this arrow on your motherboard. All right, so as long as those two are in the right place, your CPU is correctly placed. Just go ahead and pop this lever down, and your CPU is installed. And we won't do anything else to this just yet. Go ahead and take out the clips. This is for using the stock Wraith cooler, and you could definitely get away with using that for the 5600X. My experience with those coolers is that they're a little noisy. So for a high-end build, you definitely want to get a better tower cooler. In fact, this is all completely passive cooling on this motherboard. So you've got this heat pipe running through to this passively cooled M.2 heatsink. This rear I/O has this big, chunky metal heatsink cooling the VRMs. World-class, overkill VRM stages, power delivery on this board. So you won't, you can run up to a 5950X on this board, no problem. You will need a small micro screwdriver for your builds, so make sure you have one on hand. We'll go ahead and install the M.2 SSD right now. So that comes right off. Underneath is the piece that contacts your SSD. Unscrew that. Take off the plastic thermal pad cover, and now this is exposed. Pop the M.2 into the contacts, and then we'll just pop this right back in to where you had it. The M.2 storage is the sweet spot nowadays because it's not priced that much more than the SATA equivalent, but it saves you a whole bunch of cables and they run a lot faster. It just looks great from a cleanness perspective. Just screw that heatsink back. We'll go ahead and put on our cooler hardware. We've got our back plate on here still. Take these spacers from your cooler hardware kit and just pop them over the mounting bars. Don't tighten them down all the way until you've got all the screws in. Just get them in position. Okay, now you can tighten these down in a star pattern slowly, that we don't want to put uneven tension on anything. Okay, doesn't need to be over torqued, just snug it all down. So with that, the motherboard prep is complete. We can go ahead and bring the case back, and then we'll connect up the cables first. So we'll put the case back, and you can place the motherboard onto the tray. I've left this audio cable here because that's how I'm going to route it. Don't screw down the motherboard just yet, just kind of snug it up and see. One thing to do that you can do to make the build a little bit easier at this point is also just take this power connector at the back out. Just unscrew the power connector. And this will be really easy to just put back in later on, but this will give us a little more freedom when we're installing the motherboard cables and whatnot, because this is super easy to route back in. You can go ahead and connect up your front I/O. So this will connect to your USB front header. Just gently pop that in. This is your power switch. So these are all sleeved according to common motherboard designs, but do check your motherboard schematic if you're not using the same one. Otherwise, the power switch goes on the top inside. So it'll say power SW. Okay, we'll just slide that on. Very easy, not having to mess with those little cables. So now what we'll do is do some cable management beforehand, before we screw anything down. And lastly, we'll run the front panel audio cable to the corner here. Just plug that in. Make sure it's snug. All right. And we'll give it a little bit of slack here. This motherboard has a great back plate. You'll also see that there's this kind of a groove here that you can run this audio cable under, and that helps us manage this cable really easily. Next, we'll kind of start the preliminary cable management just by back feeding some of these cables into the front panel section here. You can kind of slide this into here. Just make sure everything isn't too slack here. What's going to happen is the PSU cage is going to go over here and help us manage these cables right here. So now we can take out some of our power supply cables. The two you'll need right now are the ones that are labeled CPU and also this big motherboard 24-pin ATX cable. The reason we'll plug these in first is just to make it easier from a cable management perspective. This 24-pin goes into your motherboard's 24-pin slot right here. And we'll just make sure that it's fully seated. Okay, press down all the way. In the top right corner, this is where we'll put the CPU power. To make sure that's fully seated. So we'll just channel the cables over in this general direction like this. So what I would recommend now is to take the fan, even though we're not really installing it just yet, is just to run this cable. And that's because some of the ARGB headers are in some really difficult to reach areas on your motherboard. For example, on this Gigabyte, it's between the M.2 heatsink and the RAM slots. So it's easiest for us to just route this cabling right now, rather than have to worry about it later. I'd like to run this right between the motherboard and the PSU shroud. And then we'll just go ahead and plug it in, so that'll give us RGB control of our fan. So if you are controlling any RGB other items, you'll just daisy chain them. So I will do that for the bottom fans. So we'll just make sure this header, this extension cable, can route neatly towards the bottom. And I'll just snake it right under that standoff. And that's why we haven't screwed down the motherboard yet, because we want to lift it off for components to run. And just a shot of the RGB cable, and this is where the ARGB would go in. I'll just put that in right now. Take out the stock splitter fan splitter cable, and this one connects to 3 downstream fans, so that's perfect for our build. We can go ahead and run that right now. On this board, the case fan, there's 2 case fan headers. One's a mini header, which requires a proprietary cable. But we'll just use this one because you don't need an adapter. We'll just run it right here, right by the RAM slots. And even if you're not installing all 3 fans right up front right now, you can run this anyway, because this gives you the flexibility to run them later on. So I'm going to snake this cable down through here just to follow that RGB cable, and that'll keep things nice and tidy. The other 2 ends of the fan splitter route below, and I'll run this one up top to connect to the top fan cable easily. So the way I like to cable manage in this case, I like to run the smaller cables underneath the motherboard cable, just down through the channel in between where the PSU shroud will go. And so your fan splitter cable, your RGB cables, all that stuff just goes right here next to the HD audio cable. So just a quick check, we've got our motherboard in. Screws aren't down yet, we'll tighten that down later. I'm just leaving it loose in case we have to lift anything up to cable manage or move it around slightly to get the PSU in place. The Ryzen 5600X, this is a great chip for 4K gaming. You don't really need anything more powerful than this just for gaming purposes in 2020. If you are doing something more multi-threaded, like video editing, content creation, code compilation, you may want to step up to a 5800X or even a 5900, 5950X. But for our build, since this is built as a gaming build, this is all you'll ever need. And you can put the savings towards that GPU, which is where the big bucks should be spent. Now take your PSU. So this is the 850 watt unit. Very powerful, but it'll allow us to run at max efficiency. We'll go ahead and stick this into the slot on your PSU shroud. I like the fan facing the back. You can do it either way, but that way it draws cool air. And your PSU will come with screws that you use to secure it. Once it's tight, we can go ahead and pop it in the case. So with the PSU in place, we haven't screwed it in yet, but since we have everything kind of in a rough location, and if you're not going to run any more cables underneath the motherboard, we can go ahead and take those 4 screws we saved up earlier from taking off the PCIe slots and also the side panel. And there's plenty of extra screws in the hardware pack, but that's just to keep things simple. You don't have to tighten it down all the way yet, but just secure everything down so we can flip it up and check the back. So just to show you how things look in the back now. I've run the USB 3 front header cable behind the PSU shroud. It's in the SFX position. There's a groove cut in this, so there's not an inordinate. You see these cables are still free to move. But we'll go ahead and screw down the shroud to where we took the shroud off before. This board has a back M.2 slot, and Cooler Master has very thoughtfully left this panel open. So if you ever want to add another M.2 SSD, you can just do so right at the back. Just pop up the back panel. Couldn't be easier. And so checking the back panel, we have all our cables run here. You see this is our audio cable. It was run underneath the standoff, underneath this back plate. And so that's pretty much it. It's okay to cover just a little bit of the PSU fan. It's not gonna do it any harm. So now let's do a little quick cable management. We'll back channel everything to the PSU. Take your CPU power cable. That'll be the one to run under. We'll run that ribbon flat against the side of the power supply. Same thing with the motherboard cable. Now this one from Cooler Master is super easy to run because these two things are stacked. And so we can keep that flat. So you don't have to do this part upside down, but I'm just flipping it this way so the camera can pick it up. Just take that motherboard cable, plug it back into the PSU. This one comes in 2 halves, so make sure you've got both connected. Okay, then take that CPU power cable. Any of these PCI slots will do. It says PCIe CPU, so plug that back in. Okay, at this point you can also connect your GPU cable if you'd like. It's got this one. We can connect our GPU power cable back to PSU if we'd like. It's got 2 PCIe ends here. Okay, we'll use all 8 pins for this build. This will route in right next to where the CPU cable connects. And that is all the power supply cables we'll need. So that's the lovely thing about these modular power supplies. If you are running If you do want to use a little cable management tie here, you can use the standard one from the PSU's route, or just use a zip tie just to keep things against the side here. I don't really think it's necessary because the way we've routed it, it kind of falls into place anyway, but it's definitely an option if you want. If you're going to run a SATA hard drive, you will run an extra SATA power cable to the power supply, and the SSDs will go at the front, under the front panel, or on the PSU shroud. If you're going to run a SATA data cable, you can do it now because it's still relatively easy to access. And you can also run that underneath the PSU shroud in front of that fan. Just a quick check on everything. We've got our CPU cable installed at the motherboard end. We've got our motherboard 24-pin cable installed. Power switch for the front I/O is in. For this part, you can use the Cooler Master PSU cable, PSU management straps, just to tighten everything down. You can use the zip tie too, not a big difference. These are just removable if you need. Now, with most of the internal build done, we can turn our attention to the bottom panel for the fans. These included Sickleflow fans are excellent, and you can definitely put these on the bottom of your build. But since this is a demo build, we want to go all out, and so I'm using this 3-pack here of the halos, and I'll put 2 at the bottom. You'll get a little bit better performance with the stock fans in terms of static pressure and airflow, but these halos are pretty good too, and they definitely will make our build shine a lot more. So these fans are still loose right now. We can kind of position them as needed. Note that I've run the cable on this side so that we can hide the cabling behind the GPU. And so one end of the ARGB cable will hook back up to the motherboard. And for this, I've just connected these 2 together, daisy chained. The fan includes this guy here, which you can then use to make sure the cables won't just tug out. So then I'll connect this back to our motherboard header. And I'll use another one of these to secure down the cable so it doesn't tug out. Once that's done, you can go ahead and cinch it up into the power supply organizer, just so that way it's not dangling. And what you can kind of do is route the cable under the fan just a little bit to help secure it, and then screw that down afterwards. And then what we can do now is pop this back in so that we can manage those cables. Okay, and let's leave these loose until we get the GPU, and that way we can kind of position them exactly how we want it. To kind of manage up these fan and RGB cables at the back, we can use one of the included zip ties. Just loop it around that front audio cable. And we're not going to cinch it down just yet. Just pull it to a point where you could still run cables in and out of it. And we'll tighten it later. I've also looped the splitter end through this, this part of the fan splitter cable. And then you can go ahead and route these all through and just connect them up over here. So now we can go ahead and just tighten down the zip tie after organizing it a little bit. And the fan connection side will have to kind of snake under here, but that way it'll remain accessible but still out of sight when the build is put together. Quick check to show everything so far. We've done our cable management. Motherboard is All the components are installed except for the RAM and the tower cooler. Fans are secure, cable management is done, all the power is hooked up. So now, believe it or not, we're almost done. So we can go ahead and install the cooler now. And since all the cable management is complete, you can go ahead and just secure down the motherboard, because we won't be using the back of the motherboard anymore. Just make sure all those are tight. Now we can take the included thermal paste and I'll just put a dot on the CPU. You don't need too much, a pea-sized amount usually does. Just fine. And there's enough in this tube to do a couple of remounts. We're going to line up these mounting screws with the holes on the mounting hardware. Just set it down and then grab your screwdriver. So just go ahead and tighten down the heatsink. You'll run the screwdriver through this hole to access the mounting screw underneath. Make sure you tighten down evenly because you don't want to have uneven mounting pressure. You might wonder why I leave the cooler to the very end, and that's because it really sucks to have to maneuver around a heatsink when you're working in such a tight space. And these fins are pretty painful if you were to brush up against it and cut yourself. So it's always good, at least in most SFF builds, to whenever you can, to leave the cooler installed to the end. And to minimize the interference from our 3080 GPU, our Founders Edition GPU, which exhausts out this the top, we're going to run this as a rear intake. So we push clean air into the system from the back. So you'll want to make sure that the fan is oriented this way with the labeling on the back. And typically if you lose track of which side is which, you can look on the fan itself, and what it'll have is these arrows here that'll tell you which way the airflow is going. So we'll want airflow pointing in towards the case. It helps to have the cable down as well, because that way the CPU cables, CPU header, fan header is right there. So we minimize the amount of cable dangling. Okay, and then once these clips are on, we'll just position the fan and clip it on. Okay, pretty simple. Okay, make sure it's even. This is a pretty easy install to do because the cooler has these grooves. And another reason I really like using this cooler for this build is just because it's so easy for even a first-time builder to install. I mean, the mounting hardware goes on, it's very straightforward. The cooler hooks on it's pretty much foolproof. So really solid heatsink that is not high priced. I hope you can see this. I'm just trying to show you. This is the CPU header on this board. This is why I took off the power cable. So with this routed, then you can kind of snake it around and organize it if you want. But at this point, you can pretty much just put this guy back in, because we're done with stuff on this side. So you'll notice that this header is red. That means this one is going to be the one sending back the RPM signal to your motherboard. So if you're running all similar fans, you can pretty much get a good estimate of how fast they're running if they're all in the same splitter. But if you're running dissimilar fans, you'll only get the signal, the RPM signal from the fan that's connected to it. This part's completely optional, but you could use another zip tie here just to cinch down that fan cable. Another thing you could do is just use the PSU cable for a little bit of cable management, which I'm going to do with that front audio cable anyway. But this will keep this fan cable from dangling and out of the way. Doesn't need to be super tight. Just needs to give you a little channel for things to run through. Okay. And we can put the top grill. I took it off of the Sickleflow fan. Just pop the toolless hardware into the fan. All right, before you close up the top cover, I would highly recommend checking your power supply. Make sure it's on that on position. And plug in this cable. I went ahead and brought back the top cover, so you can just stick this. It's really simple install for the fan on the top. And then you can close up shop at the top. For the most part, everything is organized here. Just a quick look at the back panel before we close it up too. Now it's time to install the RAM. Open up the slots. Some boards like this have 2 latches, some only have 1. If you look at the contacts, there's a shorter side and a longer side of your memory. Make sure you align that center notch correctly with your board's notch and slide it in, press down. You'll hear it click, and that's all it takes. The final piece of the puzzle will be the engine of our build, the graphics card. The process for installing most cards is the same. Just line up the contacts to the PCIe slot on your mini-itx board. And make sure that the PCIe slots are free from any obstruction. And make sure the metal tabs on your GPU can hook up to the case. Go ahead and open up the slot. Then push the card down firmly until you hear a click. Screw down the cards to the slots, and now your card is completely installed. Now you just need to hook up the cables. Connect it to your PSU cables. I've tried to keep these as discreet as possible. Just go down the side like that. All right. We are pretty much done. Quick check before we close everything up. GPU cables connected, RAMs inserted, coolers installed, fans plugged in, all the fans are cabled up, motherboard cables installed, CPU cable we installed, top fan is in, all the front I/O we connected up, cables are managed, and the thing to watch out for is you got to make sure to keep the cables from dangling into the path of the top fan, which if you make use of Cooler Master's included cable solution should be just fine. Big thanks for watching and following along. I hope you enjoyed the build process and that everything went together smoothly. Now the hard part begins because you have to install Windows before you can have fun. As for me, I'm going straight to Assassin's Creed Valhalla just to see how much of a challenge I can throw at these components. Well, please subscribe to stay updated for the latest content. I'll see you next time and enjoy your new build.